I'm Rebecca Lavoie, and welcome to the Undisclosed Addendum. Today we're talking about episode 3 of the new season of Undisclosed. It's about Jeff Titus, who was convicted of the 1990 murders of Doug Estes and Jim Bennett 12 years after the double homicide in 2002. Titus is currently incarcerated in Michigan and has always maintained his innocence. If you haven't listened to episode 3, we're going to be talking about plot points from that episode and other things. So pause this podcast, go listen to that, and then come back to listen to this conversation. Joining me today is Susan Simpson, co-host of the podcast Undisclosed. Hey, Susan, how are you?
Hey, Rebecca. I'm doing good.
Also with us is Kevin Fitzpatrick. He's the president of Red Marble Media, the company behind the investigation discovery documentary on the Titus case, Killer in Question. Hey again, Kevin.
Hey, how are you?
I'm great, thanks. Also with us, Jacinda Davis, the Emmy Award-winning producer, executive producer at Red Marble Media, and the peanut butter to Susan's investigative chocolate in this case. Hey, Jacinda, how are you?
I'm doing good, thanks.
Susan Simpson, before we get started talking about updates about the episode, I want to ask you about a different case. I saw some buzz on social media that another person who was the subject of an undisclosed season or series of episodes, Joseph Webster, has had his conviction vacated. Could you just remind the listeners who Joseph Webster is and just tell us what happened here?
Joseph Webster is a case we covered, I was going to say last year, but this past year has been so long, I cannot remember now. Recently, within the last year, a Tennessee murder case. He is a Nashville man, and he was convicted of the murder of Leroy Owens in 2006. But because of new DNA evidence and also witnesses that recanted their testimony, his conviction was overturned yesterday, and he got to walk home.
How many people has Undisclosed profiled or covered or investigated cases around? Are now walking around cases that you guys have looked at? It's like 10 now, right?
That's where we need Colin. He's the stats guy.
Yeah, I think by my count, it's either 9 or 10. It's really incredible. I mean, I know that you guys do a great job choosing cases where the person didn't do it and where there is a possibility of them getting out. But you guys have a very high batting average, and I'm hoping that continues. It's very exciting.
Yeah, well, there's a hope. Well, knock on wood with COVID, who knows? But speaking of upcoming hearings and cases, Joy Watkins should hopefully have his hearing soon over in Walker County in Georgia.
Now, that was season 2, correct?
Yep.
Yeah, I remember it well. It was a case in Georgia, and you were knocking on doors, doing what you do best.
It was warmer there, though.
Yeah, true. Well, this week's episode of Undisclosed was all about the crime scene and the people who were there. So, Jacinda, can you just remind me who was at the initial crime scene, some of the characters and that we sort of talk about in this episode and that you also featured on the documentary?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to start with the people who were actually in the hunting party. So that day it was Bobby Brown, his stepdad, Doug Estes, and a friend of theirs, Doug Perry. Is it Doug? No, I'm getting that name. Mark Perry. Sorry, let me start that over. And a friend of theirs, Mark Perry. So the three of them, as far as we can tell, were the first people to arrive at the scene to go hunting. Doug is the one who becomes a victim of the crime. Also there that day was Jim Bennett, who is the second victim of the crime. But what we discovered through research is that during the period of time when Bobby Brown arrived and the people in his party and Jim Bennett, there were a lot of other people who showed up. Some not hunting in that direct area, but across the creek, or the crick as they call it, and a few people who were in that exact area.
And Susan, you mentioned in the episode that a TV crew got there very quickly somehow after the bodies were discovered, and that there might be footage out there with kind of the people who were on the scene, maybe in the background.
Yeah, I'm not even sure they were so quick necessarily, though, as it was like the police were that slow. But they were there relatively soon on the scene, and they filmed. Well, what we know from people who've seen this footage and lots of people have because it was on TV, is that it shows that parking area. The crew is there in this like small parking spot. There's like the dirt road of X Avenue that runs up behind there. And they show Bobby Brown, who apparently is still pacing back and forth, possibly still with his shotgun. And it shows the group of 5 hunters, the young 20, 21-year-olds from Parchment, standing around. And given that area that's being pictured, it would most likely show the people who were at the scene, but people who were there before the police got there. So we know it includes like the Parchment hunters. We know it includes Garth Snow, for instance, and Bobby. But if there are others there, that could be important.
I would think so. Kevin, what do you think hearing about all of these people who are in the area? I mean, all I picture, and it's been described on the podcast, is this is sort of a chaotic place to go hunting where like all of a sudden like all these people come out of the woods and are kind of standing around. What do you think of this scene, and what do you think of the possibility of there being TV footage out there?
Well, I think the scene, I actually went to the scene with Susan and Jacinda, and that sort of, in my mind, kind of created a new vividness for the crime itself, because I had an understanding of the size and scope of it. It's, in my mind, it's not that big of an area when you really get out there and you start imagining all of these hunters there. I think it was in this episode of the podcast, or maybe the second one, it was described as a pumpkin patch, right? With everybody wearing their orange vests. It gets very crowded very, very quickly. And it would seem to be like utter chaos if you get more than just a few people out there. The parking lot that they're talking about, if it's the one I'm thinking about it for the news footage, it's not that big. And I would be really interested to see that footage, because you can then pick out all of the people that Susan and Jacinda are talking about in the podcast. Like, well, who is that? Is that particular person? What's that person doing there? There seem to be so many people who could have conceivably not gotten away, but just simply left the scene and weren't spoken to that particular night. And everyone's got a gun. So everyone's worth talking to. I'd be very interested in seeing that footage. And I do believe Susan and Jacinda, someone's got it. It's either in a box somewhere at the station, or it exists in a VHS in someone's attic or basement. Someone has it. I'm almost certain of that.
Yeah, I actually think so too. My husband used to work in TV news, and it is amazing what exists out there in the world. There are, by the way, lots of people who used to tape the news, like in the 90s. That was like a thing, and not erase over them. I don't know, like sort of like VCR hoarders or whatever, but that exists. But also there are also sometimes other sources for archives for local TV footage, and then there are of course cases where the tape is just thrown away or the file is written over. So it may be out there.
Yeah, it may be out there, and you're going to have to find someone, someone who just says, "Oh, maybe that's in my mom's belongings in the basement or the storage facility or something," and just has a memory of it. Either that, or you're just going to get lucky. My guess is, knowing Susan and Jacinda, that they'll figure out someone who has it, quite honestly.
Right.
Look, I'm just saying, anyone out there thinks that their grandma has in their attic and not sure which box it's in, look, call me. I'll go through them all. I'll find that thing that's there. Just let me know.
You know who's most likely to have it is somebody who knows somebody who was on the news that night. So
right.
if you can
Bill
kind
Palmatier.
of, I mean, if you can, but even not just for this story. I mean, if there's a human interest story that's on the same newscast, or there's another kind of story on the newscast, if they went to a school to do a feature or whatever, if you could even find the rundown for that newscast somewhere in their written archives, you might be able to track down people who have it on tape for a different reason.
That's a good point.
My guess is someone from Fulton has it, because that would have been this huge event, right? Like, and they would have taped it. But yeah, and that same footage would have run for several days on news stories too. So it doesn't even necessarily have to be that day.
Yeah. I mean, it could also have run as B-roll when they were talking about a trial in 2002. So you might actually want to look for Titus stories that aired in 2002 on that same TV station. You might find some B-roll there.
I think that one of the most likely candidates of someone who would have recorded all of this is Jeff Titus.
I know. I'm like, how does he not have this?
Like, I guarantee that he recorded all of it, and it was probably in his house, and at some point got thrown out.
Why do you say that?
Had to sell the house because he liked to keep stuff. He was involved in this. It happened right in his backyard.
Did he have a VHS recorder in 1990?
It's what everyone used.
Yeah, that's true. I guess.
In 1990, yeah. And he, we know that he kept articles about it, and not just about this crime, but anytime that he appeared in the newspaper, it's something that I think I wouldn't be surprised if we found out that he had copies of it somewhere.
Yeah.
But also, no one seems to have thought it was important either. Like, it's not something that the police ever seem to have cared about. It's not something anyone's ever focused on as a source of evidence, even though it seems kind of obvious that it is.
Yeah, it would seem to be the first thing that you would want to do if you were the police, was to get a copy of that and see who's standing around before you got there.
Right. And as Kevin pointed out, everybody has a gun, including Bobby, the stepson of one of the victims. And, we hear in the episode, it's him, right? Who's like, what was I going to do? Just throw down my dad's gun? And when you arrive, you would imagine you arrive at a scene where there's been a double shooting. That would be a thing you would ask people to do, to, surrender or at least put down their weapons, right?
Yeah, that's what I'd be doing.
Well,
Anyway.
and especially Bobby, who, by his own account, is extremely agitated. He's afraid. He's mad. He's accusing people or asking people, "Did you do this? Did you do this?" And he's ready to shoot anyone who
yes.
says yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's also someone named Garth Snow, who you talk about in the episode. Remind us how Garth Snow fits into this scene puzzle.
Garth Snow is the only hunter outside of the victims and the victims hunting party that we know was hunting in the east side of Bear Creek that afternoon. I found some people who hunted east side of Bear Creek in the morning that day, but as far as the afternoon goes, like the dusk hunting hour, which is usually when people are most prioritizing hunting, it was Mark Perry, Bobby Brown, Doug Estes, Jim Bennett, and then Garth Snow, who was there by himself. And he was seen by people in the parking lot, so we know he was there. But he theoretically could have been another source of evidence, but he does not appear to have seen too much. He did see someone walk back in the field not too long before the shots, which could have been Bennett theoretically. He saw some cars. He was in the parking area talking with the Palmatier group, the 5 kids from Parchment. But it's also kind of hard to understand how his story fits in with the rest of them too, because for me, one of the confusing things is that Garth Snow says when he got there to the parking lot that day, there was one car in it. It was this white top blue Taurus, and it was gone when he left. So he's like, well, who was driving that thing? That seems like worth checking out. But we know that Bobby and Doug and Mark chose that parking spot because no one was there. So how did they both, how did that group, the Doug group, get there, see no one? But when Garth Snow got there, he only sees a car that no one knows what it is and doesn't even see the truck that Doug's group came in.
Right.
So trying to make pieces fit's been hard there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't add up that that his van wasn't there when Bobby parked. When Bobby's party parked, Garth Snow's van wasn't there, because I believe Bobby would have remembered that and seen it.
And Mark would have for sure.
And Mark would have, yeah, absolutely. But yet when Snow arrives, he doesn't say that he sees their car, so it just doesn't add up, the timing really. But yet we know he was there.
So I want to talk about the timing of the arrival of the first responders. We hear this kind of strange, report that says that an ambulance was flagged down. And then we hear that the police came a while later. Do we know anything about that timing? What happened to cause the delay for the police? Why others arrived before them? I mean, it seems to be multiple people who say the police basically arrived last.
Yeah, they arrived late. I think this kind of got overlooked a bit in the initial trial because it was remarked on, but no one's it doesn't seem like this delay gets really recognized for what it was. Best we can figure out is that, and so who was it, Jacinda, who told us this, that they used to hate calling 911 because they use it and they get the wrong county?
Yeah, a couple of people told us that 911 was kind of still new and people were used to they were used to just calling the direct number to the police department or the ambulance. But the woman who did make the first call says that she called 911, and that's Sandy Elwell.
And we're guessing it probably went to Calhoun County, which is the county over, and not to Kalamazoo County, which is how the little ambulance that works for the local funeral home ended up being the only ones that responded, apparently. There are no records of any sort of dispatch for the ambulance or for the police even, other than their own report that said they got a radio call from David Landrum, the fire department guy. So we don't know exactly what happened, but that's probably the best guess. As for how the ambulance got there, there is that weird line in the report that says, supposedly from the ambulance technician or paramedic, that says, "Oh, we were just driving by and got flagged over," which makes no sense. And it's possible that's like a mistake somehow, and that maybe they were dispatched and someone there at the scene already flagged them in. I don't know.
Yeah, I was just thinking some of the listeners of this podcast might not know, because they may not have been alive yet, that 911 is not something that always existed nationally. It was kind of, I think it was the 60s or 70s that it was kind of decided, and then it took a long time to roll out this sort of coordinated response that it takes for every community in the country to have a 911 and have it connect to something. So there were places, I remember when I was a kid, where there was no 911, and then there were places where there were. So I could imagine maybe they hadn't quite figured it out yet. But I'm curious, too. I mean, you do mention, and Jacinda, I mean, do you think there's a possibility that they could have arrived at, it sounds like there were multiple places to park. If somebody called 911 and said, we're in this hunting area, could they have gone to the wrong place? Could they have, maybe, taken them a while to actually find the right place to respond to?
I don't know. It doesn't really appear that that's what happened. There is a record on call that was 6:18. And we know that, very quickly someone arrived after that call was placed.
Is there a tape or a transcript of that call?
No. So the best we can figure out, that was David Landrum, who was the fire department guy who just happened to be hunting that day at the game area. And when he saw the ambulance drive into the Fulton City game area, he went over. I think he said to us that he had his radio with him. He's like, "Wait, why is the ambulance coming out here? No one's radioing the fire department guys. Like, hey, there's a situation. Go check it out." So he goes over. He's like, "Oh God, don't touch the bodies, guys. Don't put them in the ambulance yet. I'm gonna get the police." So he goes to a house somewhere and just calls them himself. Like, "Hey, y'all need to get down here. We got some people shot. Could be a homicide."
Yeah, and it's possible when Sandy made that call to 911, at that point, all she knew was that someone was yelling in the woods and her husband had gone to help. And I believe she told us, Susan, right, that her husband yelled back, like, "Grab my gun and call 911 or something like that, or grab a flashlight, I forget. And he went off to check it out, and she went in to call 911. At that point, all she knows is that something's wrong. She doesn't know whether she needs the police or ambulance or what. So there could have been a little bit of a miscommunication at that point as well.
I just want to say again, because I have a question that relates to it that I will ask later, that I cannot believe there are this many people in an area where people are hunting with loaded guns and just walking around. I went for a walk today in my very rural town. I ran into one hunter on a 5-mile walk. It's muzzleloader season. And sometimes you're walking through the woods on the trails and you run into hunters. I ran into one on a 5-mile walk, and I still felt like, oh my God, like that was something to see somebody walking around with this long gun. And you just sort of came upon me in his camouflage. But there are houses. I mean, this just sounds like so unbelievably dangerous and like such a chaotic scene. Am I wrong, Kevin? Am I wrong?
No, I mean, I keep trying to understand it, and not being from Kalamazoo County and not being a hunter, I don't want to say it's crazy or something like that, because it's not something I understand. The way that I keep likening it is that I keep telling myself that part of the reason it was so crowded must have been that it was the opening few days of hunting season. And then
people were psyched, the other thing, in other words.
Right. And I think that they have a very limited window. I don't know how long. I can't remember
15 days.
Yeah, it's not very long. So when we were out doing the interviews in Kalamazoo County, we spoke to Jeff Titus's cousin, Lola Hedges. And one of the things I distinctly remember her saying was that if it wasn't for something this important, meaning doing an interview about her cousin, she wouldn't give up one of her hunting days. Right. And in the podcast, this last episode, I can't remember who it was. Maybe it was Mark Perry talking about calling in sick to work that day.
Right.
It was Paul Mathieu or Phil Dooley. Yeah.
Right. To be able to go hunting. And so there's this, it was such a limited window. I think this is one of the few public places that I'm aware of, and I could be wrong, that people can go. And so I think all of that created a much more chaotic scene. But it also creates this thing in the back of my mind, then why doesn't anybody know what happened?
Right.
If there's so many people there, why is it so unclear exactly what happened, other than people must have just been stunned at that particular time? But we were actually there filming interviews on what would have been the anniversary of the crime. And I do know that everybody was wearing orange.
Yeah.
I mean, just like everywhere. This is pre-pandemic, and just like in a restaurant, people wearing orange.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just to let the audience know for safety, I also have an orange vest. My dogs also don their orange vest when we go on these walks during muzzleloader season. And I avoid the woods during actual like regular gun season because, sometimes you run into more than one person.
Well, what shocks me too, though, in the reports,
yeah,
there are like numerous people who are described as out there hunting, or maybe not hunting, but out there for whatever reason, and they're not in orange.
Yeah. They're just walking around.
Like, they're just asking for trouble. I don't understand why there, of all places, people would do that.
Okay, so you know what? I was going to ask this later, but I'm just going to ask it now. I would love for the three of you to just like weigh a potential theory of this that I was thinking about as I was producing this week's episode. Is it possible, given the chaotic nature and the number of people walking around with guns in this space, that this was, these two deaths started as an accident that perhaps turned into something else? Like maybe one of these guys was shot accidentally. The other guy went over to help, and the person who shot him realized that they were going to be in big trouble, so they killed the second guy. That is something that I've been thinking about, because I'm thinking like, in order to commit a murder, this is like a strange place to go, unless you're thinking like no one will hear my shots. But what do you think? Has that crossed any of your minds at all, that it could be something like that?
I don't think you accidentally shoot it less than 8 feet, though.
Oh. Well, okay. I guess that answers that question. I mean, so the evidence shows that they were both shot within that close range, definitely?
They don't have the exact space. Like, it's under 8 feet at the very tops. Like, This is pretty close.
Right. Okay.
8 feet, so they say is there. It could be a little bit more theoretically, but there's no way it's going to be long enough for like you can mistake for a deer.
Right.
One of the things that stood out to me was the first in-person conversation, or the first conversation period I had with Detective Bruce Worsima. I sort of asked him that very thing, and this was before cameras were even rolling. And I think he really said, I was hoping that it was on my way out there, and he was hoping that it was kind of as he got there and started going through the scene. And it just very quickly became apparent that it wasn't. I mean, they were both shot like through the deer tags and in the back. And I mean, and there was this, it was almost like he kind of said, oh man, really? Jacinda, do you remember that moment? That's kind of how I remember him telling the story. Like he wanted it to be, and it was just clear it wasn't.
Yeah, absolutely. He was hoping it was an accident, that it could be explained, that there would be an easy explanation for what happened or what went wrong. And very quickly, it did not appear to be any kind of accident.
Well, I also was wondering, as an extension of that, whether or not one of these men was the intended victim and the other man happened upon the scene. I mean, that's something that I'm sure you guys have thought about, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's been definitely, before they decided it was Titus, that was a thing they frequently wondered about. And they often decided, well, for some reason, they all seem to think it was Doug Estes that was the target and Bennett that was the accident, which is not something that I've quite understood their certainty about.
That's really interesting. All right, so let's go back to the people on the scene, which you gave very helpful nicknames to during this episode. And I'll just tell you, I really appreciate it. As someone who's not great with names, I'm definitely going to remember Ditch Guy, Kenny Rogers, and Stephen King. So first, Ditch Guy. He's the guy who had a car that had driven into a ditch, and there was a truck that pulled him out. Can you just flesh that out a little bit, why he might be important?
Sure. Well, I mean, the Ditch Guy is important because in terms of timing, the shots are heard. And then, I don't know, maybe 15 minutes later, a car is heard speeding down the road and going into a ditch. And one of the neighbors is called to the scene, Mrs. Helen Knopfs, who lives down the street from this ditch. someone calls her and says, hey, there's a car in the ditch. Do you think your husband could come? And I think the husband wasn't there that day, whatever. So she went down. She talks to this man. He's, by her description, he's nervous. He didn't want help from the police. He was sweaty. He was agitated. He was wearing an orange knit hat. He had glasses on. And, is it just a coincidence, or was he fleeing from a crime scene? Was he sweaty and agitated because his car just went on the ditch and he's pissed off? Or is he sweaty and agitated because he just committed a crime and needs to get out of there as fast as he can?
Did he steal a rabbit, in fact?
I think in the show, one of the cold case detectives, Mike Brown, says maybe he just stole a rabbit from a farmer. Another one says maybe he was cheating on his wife that day. Like, why was he upset? Why was he so agitated? Is there a connection? And the problem is, no one's ever been able to talk to him.
Right. Whenever I hear about somebody who doesn't want the police called when they've been in a car accident, I think that they may have been drinking. That's the first thing that I always think of.
Yeah.
And that's what I thought about Ditch Guy as well. So did the cops try to find him, Susan?
They tried pretty hard. I think it was one of their leads they pursued, probably, I don't want to say the most intensively, but pretty intensively. They put out flyers to all the local bars, local shops and whatnot that showed the car, or a rough approximation of the car, and the composite image prepared by Helen Noss and her son. And they took out an ad in the newspaper even. And they got responses. Like, they heard from people who had also driven by and seen the car in the ditch and who saw the truck that pulled it out at some point. But none of them had more info than that. Like, they could confirm that, yeah, a car went in the ditch there, a truck pulled it out, but no one ever figured out who the guy in the ditch was or the truck guy was.
So then we have Kenny Rogers, white hair, white beard. But as you point out, a lot of people might fit that description, the Kenny Rogers description. Yeah.
And that's all we have to go on. So doesn't really narrow down the universe there too much.
So why was the timing of his being on the scene strange?
It's possible he's a red herring, and of all these guys, all the unknowns, he's the biggest question mark for me, because I don't really even so much of a theory to explain him. And it's possible he was just out there hunting and just, wandering through, missed all the bodies, just didn't see anything, went home.
Right.
And we know, for instance, that Bennett had gotten back there without some of the hunting people seeing him, so it's possible. But at the same time, like, from where he was seen, the most logical place he would have been is back behind south of the field there. And if he was, then how did he possibly not see the bodies?
Maybe he was trapped in some of that famous quicksand that is there. That was really stunning to me to hear that there was actually such a thing. When we were all kids, I think we all thought quicksand.
That's what
was
I thought. I'm like, wait, it's real.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's the character who is described by people as Stephen King because of his distinctive glasses. Did anybody besides me wonder if those distinctive glasses may have been safety glasses worn for hunting?
No, but that's a good thought. Is that a thing?
I need to join this team. I'm
throwing
out theories left and right.
No, I feel like the glasses were he's described as Stephen King because Stephen King wore those kind of distinctive glasses back in the 90s.
Right.
The wire rim glasses.
They are kind of creepy looking, I'm not going to lie. When you pull pictures of like Stephen King 1990, I'm like, whoa, that dude was scary looking.
Well, talk about why this is an important potential character in this story, the way that he interacted people. Can you just talk about that a little bit, Susan?
Because he's super weird.
Yeah.
Super, super weird.
Yeah. He was the one saying, do you want to go see a couple of bodies?
You want to go see some bodies?
Right.
It's such a bizarre scene, and it was shocking. And when Jacinda and I first heard about him, when we saw him, I think we were both blown away because it's such a vivid and kind of insanely creepy encounter, and it's only barely and glancingly mentioned in the reports. And the reports don't give this sense of okay, this is possibly important and at very least bizarre. Definitely need to check that out.
Kevin, what do you think of somebody on the scene asking people, do you want to go see a couple of bodies?
Yeah, I think it's very unusual that somebody would want to do that. The interesting thing is, it's really one of those things where I always feel like I need to see the person and hear from them to know just how unusual it is. You don't know but what I'm saying is how they're asking, what they're saying. I do know through years of just sort of doing some crime shows, that in hindsight, sometimes people have a tendency to misinterpret things.
Yeah,
I'm not saying
fair
that
enough.
that's what happened in this instance at all. But I do know that people will tend to say, yeah, I wonder if that was a guy. And sometimes they could be spot on and sometimes they're not. I always would want to see the person myself. But yeah, it's a little unusual. It's certainly worth further investigation, that you'd want to know why this person is saying that, what the purpose is.
And why he's there.
You have to be able to identify that person to sort of put that theory to rest. It's a viable concept of could he be involved, or what does he know and what was he doing there, until you can identify the person.
Well,
another reason why seeing that footage is so important. Maybe he's in that footage.
And it wouldn't be unprecedented for someone who had committed a crime like this to stick around on the scene to wait for police response. I mean, that is something that sometimes happens. Jacinda, I'm wondering what you think, because the first thing that popped into my mind when I heard that he was saying something like, whether it was being interpreted as creepy or just remembered that way, want to go see some bodies, it meant that he had seen the bodies, right?
Right. I mean, that when Susan and I were talking to people and this was brought up to us, it was hard to wrap your head around it. Like, wait, did he really say, do you want to go see bodies? Or is he asking, like, do you want to come back and help? Like, was he saying it out of concern, or was he saying it out of like
creepiness?
Creepiness, right? And it really does seem like it was out of creepiness. But you're absolutely right. How did he know there were two bodies back there? Is it because he actually saw the two bodies? But by this point, there's a lot of people. Bobby Brown's walking around, pacing back and forth. By this point, it is conceivable that people knew that two people had been shot.
What is strange, though, is that what Bill Palmatier recalls is that Stephen King told him he'd found the bodies.
The other interesting thing to me, and it's a bit of a stretch, but Stephen King, in his description, it sounds a lot like the driver of the car of the man in the ditch.
It could be the same guy.
The glasses match, the hat matches. There's a lot of similarities there. Now, of course, a lot of people were wearing orange hats because it's hunting season, and a lot of people had those glasses back in 1990. But is it possible that whoever was driving the car in the ditch got out, circled back, and wanted to check out the crime scene?
Susan, what do you think in terms of these overlapping descriptions? Do you think that there were fewer people there than there could be when you make your long list of potential witnesses?
I think the timing makes it hard for Ditch Guy to be Stephen King, but at the same time, it's so tempting to make a connection there because of the glasses, which again is not like the most hugely distinctive detail of all time. So maybe it is just a red herring, but you're like, okay, what are the odds that two strange weirdos at the crime scene had these glasses? Maybe pretty good. I don't know. So at this point, I'm open to possibilities. But I don't think it's conclusive at all that they are one and the same.
Right.
Maybe we should call Stephen King just to rule him out completely.
The actual Stephen King?
Yes.
The actual Stephen King.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't go unnoticed by me anyway that "Do you want to go see a body" is also a very famous piece of dialogue in a Stephen King story.
Wait,
The Body.
it is?
Yes,
Oh,
The
God,
Body,
yes,
on
it is.
which Stand By Me is based on.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, that was just an interesting detail that made me remember the Stephen King character very well. Are there any other unknown people sort of seen in the area that might be of interest?
There's so many people out there that were never identified tons. I would definitely want to know who all of them are, but these are the ones that I think are most likely to lead towards information about the crime.
All right. Well, you'll get to some listener questions about this case in just a couple of minutes. But first, I want to just take the opportunity to talk about a different case. Jacinda and Kevin, on Killer in Question, there was another case that you covered, the Duckett case. And for anyone who didn't see the episode, Jacinda, would you mind just giving us an overview of that case?
Sure. James Duckett was a police officer in Mascot, Florida, who was tried and convicted of murdering 11-year-old Teresa Maccabee. This is back in 1987. And, there are some similarities to the Titus case in one aspect is you had two different sets of police officers who did not agree. One, Rocky Harris, was one of the investigators who right away picked out Duckett as the number one suspect. But there was also Duckett's chief of police of Mascot, James Brady, who all along didn't think Duckett was involved and to this day doesn't think he committed the crime.
Kevin, what is most interesting to you about the Duckett case? Why does it make a great subject for Killer in Question episodes?
Well, I will tell you the reason that I find it so interesting, and I do. I mean, Jacinda has this habit of bringing me incredibly compelling stories, and I'm like, that can't be true. But I think because I don't know that there's enough evidence to actually convict him, and yet I'm almost 100% certain that he actually did the crime. He actually committed the murder. Yes. And I think that there is just this sense that there are too many sort of things that point to him, but the evidence that they put together and the case that I think that they created to present to a jury, I don't think that there's much there. I mean, I think that you can throw out the eyewitness. I think that she's proven to be completely unreliable. I haven't seen anyone explain to me who's an expert in it that the tire tracks and some of that evidence definitively points to Officer James Duckett. I just don't know how you could convict him based upon the evidence that I've seen, yet I'm almost certain that he did it. And I think that there's also this part of the story that's, I don't know what the correct word for it is. I mean, compelling isn't right, but it sort of terrifies you, the concept that a police officer, someone who's sworn to protect all of us, could be the one responsible for harming a child. And I think that made me sort of terrified each moment that I was sort of diving into the case. So I think it creates this question in people's minds, right? Like, is the case strong enough to convict him? No.
Well, maybe.
You want him? well, okay. Well, yeah. Okay. And certain people think so, right? And that's fine. And I guess it's just this. It's what we've tried to do with this show is create these moments where we're asking people to look at it and be like, is there enough here to convict him? Is there not? And the fact that Susan disagrees with me is actually good for the show.
Yeah, I want to hear more about that. Can I hear some more about this evidence against Duckett? You mentioned tire prints. You mentioned an eyewitness. Jacinda, what was the other evidence against this guy?
So there's a few pieces of evidence that was used in the trial. And the main ones are there were fingerprints on the hood of the car of Teresa's fingerprints and Duckett's fingerprints, and they seem to be interlaced and facing in a direction that it looks like Teresa was laying back. Her hands were moving away from the front. It's hard to describe, away from the car, and his hands were probably on top of her hands, so that the fingerprints are interlaced.
It looks really bad.
It does look really bad. There are tire tracks. Tire tracks were found near where her body was found. There's snow tire tracks, which one is very unusual for Florida, especially in 1987. And it just so happened that the police department got two sets of snow tires because the local tire supplier accidentally ordered them, and he gave the police department a really good discount, and the cars needed new tires. So the car that James Duckett was driving had snow tires, and if you look at the tire treads, they seem to be a match. The other piece of evidence was there was an eyewitness who claims that she saw James Duckett drive off with a little girl who she later learned was Teresa in his car the night she disappeared.
Now, was this his car or was it a patrol car?
His cop car, yeah.
Okay.
His patrol car. And then the other piece of evidence was there was a pubic hair found on Teresa, and one of the experts the prosecutor used, identified it as belonging to James Duckett.
Jacinda, do you have an opinion about his culpability? I mean, do you agree with Kevin here? Are you on the fence?
What's really funny about this? Like, I go back and forth. I like things to be like 100% certain. It's really hard for me to come to a conclusion if I don't have certainty. When I started this case, I thought for sure he was guilty. I still think he probably did it. I think I agree with Kevin on that. And actually, when I first told Susan about this case, Susan, do you remember? You were like, "Oh, he's guilty." But
then I came back again. I came back briefly, and then I was like, "Oh no, I'm not doing that one."
So, Susan, is that where you are now too?
I think his case is a great example of like why bad investigation can get bad results, because this case was based on some real good physical evidence, and also has a witness who's obviously painfully lying. Like, she's obviously lying. You have to believe investigators either knew she's lying or they're, frankly, just bad investigators. And they use her. Surprise, surprise, she was lying. They also had some bogus forensic evidence in the form of the hairs and the hair matching. And the FBI agent involved there is notorious for, just pseudoscience. So you've got a case that has some real good physical evidence combined with some atrocious, misleading evidence. And that does create some doubt and does undermine the case.
We talk about this a lot at my house, just so you know, like one of the most famous cases in the history of crime in the modern era is the Pam Smart case. And Kevin and I argue about this all the time because this particular instance of like a bad case or in this case, a bad trial, an imperfect trial. A lot of people think, she was responsible for the murder of her husband, but it's very hard to argue that she didn't have a very, very imperfect process, an imperfect trial. I don't know for sure that she is, directly responsible for her husband's murder, but where do you land on that, Susan? When you really in your gut or you see enough evidence that somebody very likely did it or you think did do it, but the process is bad, do you think they still deserve a second chance at the process? What do you think?
As an attorney, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree.
And it's not just a question of like, a guilty person going home technicality. No, like if you don't have constitutional due process in a case, no one's going to get it, guilty or innocent. And it's the state's job to get a constitutional conviction. And when they screw it up, they screw it up. But this case in particular is not one we'd probably be covering on Undisclosed. but I'll say at the same time, just because that's my general take on the case, like there are question marks. This case is short of like the ironclad, totally conclusive evidence you see in some cases. I actually think that's kind of stronger, than Kevin and Jacinda do, or at least when they were first describing the case to me, I was thinking like, okay, well, actually, that sounds kind of not so conclusive. That sounds kind of weak. And then I was like looking at the filings, some more evidence. I'm like, oh, that sounds actually more conclusive than I was.
Yeah.
What I wonder about the case too is exactly what you're saying, Susan. Right? Is I look at it sometimes, and I say, I'm so overwhelmed by the witness stuff, and by the fact that the FBI forensic person, I think, was just making stuff up and had a questionable track record. That do I discount the other evidence that they have? Because I'm so alarmed by that. And I think that I catch myself from doing that sometimes. I'm also disturbed by the fact that I don't think they looked at any other viable options, i.e. people who lived in that house. And I don't think that happened. We talk about people leaving the parking lot from the Fulton game area. I mean, there are people who left the actual house where the little girl lived and nobody talked to them.
Right.
And that perplexes me a little bit in terms of the investigation. But I don't have any doubt I shouldn't say I don't have any doubt. I think that he's guilty.
Yeah.
I think that Duckett is guilty.
Yeah. Were you able to speak to Duckett, Jacinda, in the production of the episode?
James Duckett and I exchanged emails. We did not have an opportunity to talk on the phone, and he declined to participate, via phone. So I have exchanged emails with him.
Does he have a current active defense?
He has a defense. He has a lawyer who's working with him, and he to this day maintains his innocence, and he is hoping, to get some sort of appeal or new trial or something.
He seems to have complimented Jacinda on the show.
It's true. I got an email from him that, basically he said a couple people have reached, he hasn't seen it. A couple people reached out with positive feedback saying that it was fair and that now he regrets that he didn't agree to participate. I think he was skeptical of our intentions. I try my best to be upfront whenever I'm booking an interview and I explain we're showing both sides of the story, their perspectives, and that's my agenda, is to get both sides of the story told. But he I think was, I don't know that he believed that. And now that he's getting feedback that it was fair from the people he's talked to, he said he regrets doing it. Now, I have to admit that made me feel a little funny because like Susan was saying, everyone deserves a fair trial. If you believe in the justice system, whether they're guilty or innocent or whatever, we work on this basis that we're going to get a fair trial. We're going to have representation. And I do believe that if he was to get a new trial, I don't think that he would be convicted. I don't think he'd be convicted. Right. And, from like a personal kind of internal conflict, it's like, does that mean like, in some way, are we helping like potentially a guilty man who murdered an 11-year-old girl get out? Like, is that okay on a personal level?
I feel like you wouldn't. I think that you couldn't do justice to this, even if like it was assumed and like agreed and everyone universally acknowledged that Duck was guilty. You couldn't do justice to this case by telling it without showing the ambiguities. Like that is this case.
Right.
I mean, that's the only way to be fair. I mean, Susan, I remember listening to when we were producing the Adnan Syed episodes, a case that's very personally close to Rabia, obviously. And you and Colin and even Rabia sometimes were very willing to say, yeah, but this could also mean XYZ. Do you understand what people might think it might mean XYZ? It always strikes me that if you don't do that, you lose credibility. I mean, Kevin and I have written several books together. In almost every instance, the people who declined to participate regretted declining to participate. And the thing to understand is there are a lot of bad actors out there, so I understand why people decline to participate that aren't. But when you do a fair look at a case, you cannot represent somebody fully if they don't talk to you. It's very, very hard to do. And I'm curious to know what he would have said to you, had he talked to you. Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, through his emails, he would send me long emails, with his perspective on everything from tire prints to the hair to Gwen Gurley to feeling like he was railroaded. And, he feels very strongly that people were out to get him and evidence was manipulated. And he even thinks the victim's mother was manipulated in some way. So I do have a sense of what he would say. And he would say it's all wrong and that he's an innocent man.
But he was involved in another case as well, right?
Well, possibly.
Possibly. Yeah. Go ahead, Susan. Sorry.
No, he's not. It was never charged. They've never shown interest in actually charging him. So it may be truly unfair to him, but there's definitely, I'd say widely acknowledged. Is that fair to say, Jacinda, that he was like the lead suspect in another murder?
I think it is widely acknowledged that he is the suspect in another murder of a girl named Jennifer Weldon, who went missing in September of '87. So just several months after Teresa was murdered. Her body was found in October. And Duckett has been, at least in newspaper accounts, he's been cited as the one and only suspect. But like Susan said, he has never been charged. There's never been any charges brought against him. So again, like how likely is it that he really is involved if they haven't brought any charges? I don't know.
Well, on the other hand, what's also possible is that they know there's flaws in his case. It's possible at least his conviction for Teresa's murder could be overturned. So they could be holding that in their back pocket.
On the Weldon case, you mean?
Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, just so you know, full disclosure, I just looked up the case a little bit while you were talking. And I don't know. He's definitely the subject of a lot of speculation online, which means nothing other than the fact that there's ambiguity. And I do think the cases with ambiguity are very often the most interesting. But I will say his mugshot, not a great look. Not a great look.
Well, Jeff Titus would say the same thing.
What's interesting about the Duckett story is that, we were able to find his audio of his interrogation from 1987.
Really?
So you're able to hear him respond to all of these points, the fingerprints, the tire tracks, the hair, etc. You hear him talking about these things with investigators. So you're able to hear what he has to say about it at the time, which I think is really interesting and added a lot to the documentary.
You know what's interesting? I was thinking about what Kevin said earlier about, this being an interesting case because it was a cop. What makes it an interesting case to me, not that it was a cop, because cops are people and cops are just as likely to commit crimes as any other kinds of people, in my opinion, but that other cops were sure of his guilt. I mean, that usually is the problem, too. Right? Like, isn't it usually the problem that cops cover up things that cops do?
Well, I think one of the interesting things about it is how quickly he became a suspect. I mean, he became the suspect at the crime scene in the eyes of the lead investigator and of the sheriff of the county. They thought at the scene that the tire tracks from his car matched the tire tracks leading to where the little girl's body was dumped, to where Teresa was found. And one of the things that I always wonder about just human nature is, at what point does his behavior, then everything he's done, become suspicious? So they point to the tire tracks, and then as Jacinda is interviewing the lead investigator, they're talking about how Duckett didn't come to the scene when they'd found the body, for 2 hours, but he only lived a half hour away. Okay, well, then it depends on who you talk to, because he had just worked an overnight shift. He'd been looking for her, and then his sheriff says, well, I told him not to rush over. I told him, come on over, and he told me it was going to take a minute. So it took 2 hours. Now, does that 2 hours seem more suspicious because you think they're his tire tracks? Did they seem suspicious at the time when he didn't show up for 2 hours? Or does your brain do some reworking to now you're putting in other facts? It's I think that's an interesting part of the equation of how much can people still remain impartial and look just at the evidence.
Right.
Because you don't know.
Was there work history or relationships with his fellow officers that had gone bad at some point? I mean, was he somebody that, people didn't like, Jacinda? What do you think?
Well, he was a rookie cop. He had only been on the job for a few months. Depending on who you talk to, he seems like he was well liked. He was married. He had 2 kids. He was very earnest. Chief Brady says he tried hard, to do the right thing. He was learning the job. But there is also indication that he had some relationships with some of the women in town and was known for that as well. So again, it depends on who you talk to.
And I'll say those relationships don't seem necessarily wholly consensual to me. I think there's a lot of ambiguity was going on, but I think there is an inference that can be made that he was using his status as an officer to coerce women to get into his cop car and engage in sexual acts.
Yeah, maybe relationship is not the right word, because that does make it seem consensual.
Yeah, well, that's not unheard of. I mean, there's cases of that all over the country, and it's not illegal in some places, which is astonishing. What were you going to say, Kevin?
No, I was going to ask Jacinda, now, would these Sheriff's Department investigators have even really known him? Because, and I don't know how it works, is more sort of asking, because he worked at Mascot. There were only really 2 officers. I don't know how much interaction they ever had with any of these other Sheriff's Department folks. They called them to do the investigation when they realized they had a body. But I don't know I honestly don't know if Rocky even knew him, right?
Yeah, I don't think Rocky had met him before, at least didn't know him well. So it was that day when the Sheriff's Department was called to help. And again, like Kevin was just saying about how, the way you see things once you have a suspicion, oh, he was just weird. His demeanor was weird. He was something odd about him. Like immediately they see his personality as incriminating.
Right. Which is, it's the confirmation bias, right? You have, someone tells you that someone is bad or that someone did something bad, and then you start, framing everything that way. So we say this all the time. If I ended up dead tomorrow and my husband were a suspect, like the most innocuous text message he sent me the day before could be interpreted completely differently. But no, I mean, this is really interesting. I'm going to look more into this. And as I'm looking at some of the photos from 1987, this again proves my point that in the 80s, people looked a lot older than they do now.
Because they did. It's true. There's like a time warp that happened.
What is going on? He's 30. He looks like he's about 55 in this photo of him from 1987. But no, I'm definitely going to go back and watch that episode. It sounds really fascinating. And it's really interesting to me to hear that Jacinda thinks he might be guilty, that Kevin is pretty sure he's guilty. It's a really interesting angle to take when doing a show like Killer in Question. So good on you guys. I think that's really cool. So we have a couple listener questions just in the last couple minutes. Susan, you mentioned in my notes here, in the notes that you wrote for me, that there is one question that's come up over and over and over and over again this week as people have submitted questions to Undisclosed. Do you just want to go ahead and just kind of say what the theme of that question is?
Yeah. So probably definitely the most common question we've gotten so far is from people who've seen the Killer in Question episode on Titus's case and have wanted to know, was the ditch guy, was his car a match for Thomas Dillon's serial killer in Ohio who liked to target outdoorsmen. And long story short, yes, the cars are a match. Ditch guy says that he's driving his wife's car, and it's a very close match for what Thomas Dillon's wife drove. So that part does line up. There was no, I guess in Killer in Question, y'all didn't have time to cover all that.
Yeah, it's actually one of our great pains is that we didn't. And we went back out to Michigan and we showed some of this stuff to Bruce Worsima, including the recording you were kind enough to provide to us. And Jacinda showed him that the cars were a match. And I thought he was going to, he felt like he'd blown it. Unfortunately we couldn't get everything in. That's why we're so happy you guys are doing the story on the podcast, because we couldn't get it all in.
Oh, Susan will get it all in. She'll get all of it in. Another question along the same lines from a listener named Brad wants to know if anyone showed the picture of Thomas Dillon to the guys that saw Stephen King or the ditch guy. Did you guys do that in your investigation, or do you know if anyone else did?
Well, the ditch guy witnesses did ID him back in 93.
Okay.
In a live lineup.
Yeah.
For the Stephen King people, I've showed them photos of Dillon, but this far on, it definitely wasn't they definitely did not recognize him. But it's also been 30 years, so I'm not surprised one way or another by that.
Well, and I think to Susan, didn't we even show Bobby the composite? Mm-hmm. And I don't think he recognized him as the man he pointed the gun at either.
Well, I'm very much enjoying the season so far, Susan. So I'm looking forward to hearing what's coming up next. Do you want to just give us a hint about what we're going to be hearing in next week's Undisclosed?
The gun evidence.
All right.
The ballistics and how the shotgun was found, which is probably the main piece of evidence against Titus.
Well, I can't wait to listen to it. So, Kevin, what can you tell me about what's coming up on Killer in Question?
So this Sunday, we have an episode about a triple murder in Lake Charles, Louisiana in 1997. There is someone currently in prison for those murders by the name of Thomas Sisko. And the interesting thing about this story is he tells you 10, 12, 15 different versions of what happened that night. And part of the thing you have to figure out as you watch it is, what do you think happened? And, when somebody gives you that many stories, it's hard to know. And that's one of the most fascinating things about this particular story is you have to decide, what do you believe when he's saying it? And he implicates a lot of people. He has pointed the finger at many folks, and in one or two instances done incredible sort of damage to their lives. And I think it's an interesting story about how do you believe what someone is telling you when they have a history of lying about this specific moment. And pretty sure something he said along the lines was true. but you don't know maybe what. Wouldn't you say that's right, Jacinda?
Yeah, absolutely. It's, how can you believe someone who was involved when they're telling you different stories every time you talk to them? And what does that mean? What does it mean that there's still someone out there who may be connected to this crime?
And I'll say my take on this case is on a very different page from Jacinda and Kevin.
Really?
Which is the best thing, because every time I bring up a case to Susan or she brings up one to me, we never initially agree on it.
We'll circle around back sometimes, but sometimes we always start off totally different.
Right.
Susan, you should feel free to say what you think.
We'll watch the episode, get next addendum, get more into that. I'll let people make their own decisions.
Well, I'm curious about it, Susan, because, you very famously covered another case with a serial liar who tells lots of versions of his story. And, a lot of people, including me, think that he had nothing to do with it, despite talking a lot and telling a lot of different stories. So I don't know. It'll be really interesting to watch. I can't wait to see it. Jacinda and Kevin from Red Marble Media, thank you so much for joining me for this week's addendum. I look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us
as well.
And Susan Simpson, always a pleasure to talk to you and always a pleasure to produce your episodes of Undisclosed. Talk to you soon, okay?
See you soon, Rebecca.
Thanks so much for listening to this week's addendum, and thanks for listening to Undisclosed. If you have questions about the Titus case or anything else that you see on Killer in Question or hear in the podcast, send them to us on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. The handle is always at Undisclosed Pod, and you can also, if you'd like, hashtag UDAddendum. Audio production for this podcast is by Hannah McCarthy. The executive producer of Undisclosed is Mithil Telhan. If you want to hear more from me, check out my true crime review podcast. It's called Crime Writers On. And yes, follow Undisclosed on social media. You won't regret doing it. I'm Rebecca Lavoie for everyone at Undisclosed. We look forward to talking to you again next week.